So I was able to get an invite to the 40k Darktide beta that happened this weekend, so I figured I would, just film some of it and show some impressions of it because it's a game that I'm excited for and it's a game that I wanted to actually get a taste of, so I was happy to be able to play it a little bit. I unfortunately didn't get to play it quite as much as I wanted because I've been really busy over the weekend and stuff, but still I was able to get several matches in and actually get a good feel for what's going on and just form a good opinion of what I thought of the current state of the beta, and I honestly had a really good time with it. You're going to see two matches in the background because some of the others were corrupted footage because of some performance issues, but that's not entirely the game's fault itself, really. It's the recording software kind of works oddly sometimes with performance issues, and it can cause some really weird stuff to happen, so that's not entirely the game's fault. But yeah, the first mission that you're going to see is my actual very first mission when I didn't really know what I was doing, and then the second one that you're going to switch to is much later on when I'm actually more familiar with how to play my class properly. So first off, what even is Warhammer 40,000 Darktide? Well, Darktide is made by the people, Fat Shark, that made Vermintide, and it is, just like that, a 4-player co-op shooter, so think like Left 4 Dead if you've never played one of these games, something like that. But where Vermintide was focused very heavily on melee combat, this is a 40k game, and you have to focus more on ranged combat in this game instead of just going pure melee. Now, Vermintide did have some ranged options, but they were very limited, and honestly they weren't that fun to use. The love and attention was clearly put into the melee weaponry of Vermintide. That was the main point of the game, right? But in something like this, you have to really shift the focus and be more like 50-50 split between ranged and melee. There were 4 different classes for you to choose from. I chose to level a Psyker because I tend to favor like spell sword-like characters in games. That tends to be my favorite thing to play. So a Psyker makes sense, power sword plus revolver sounds like a good time to me. And it turns out I actually gel really well with the Psyker class. It was very fun to play once I figured it out. But there were 3 others to play as well, including an Imperial Guardsman veteran who was just happy to be there, and an Ogren brick wall. How would I describe an Ogren to someone that's never played 40k? You know those crushers in junkyards that turn cars into cubes? An Ogren is kind of like a living version of one of those. They may not be the smartest race in the setting, but if you need something turned into a fine paste, like right now, they'll be happy to do that for you. And as it turns out, the Ogren was actually my favorite teammate to have on the team with me because they're just really good at dispersing hordes and things, because they can just walk into a horde and just swing wildly and murder everything. I mean, they're also really funny, though. The banter, the dialogue between characters is genuinely really well written and voice acted in this game, and kind of impressive how they actually link into each other depending on who was on your team. They did a really good job of making it feel like a natural conversation between friends, kind of, and the Ogrens are particularly funny. So first off, how does the game actually feel? Is this just Vermintide with guns? And the answer is, it kind of is Vermintide with guns, but there's more to it than that sounds, because, like I mentioned, Vermintide was a very melee-focused game, and it had extremely satisfying melee combat. Giving rats the old stick bonk was really, really fun in that game, but the ranged combat wasn't really that great. So in this game, they had sort of an uphill battle when it comes to making the ranged combat as satisfying as the melee combat, because obviously they could just take the melee combat engine from Vermintide and transplant it into the 40k setting and it would work just fine, and that's exactly what they did. So melee combat in this game still feels very, very good. But, in my opinion at least, they've done a very admirable job of making the ranged combat fun. It is way better than it was in Vermintide, and there's a lot more options as well. For instance, the Psyker starts out with a 5-shot revolver that is extremely powerful and can one-shot a lot of enemies if you hit them in the head, but is balanced by having a reload time of roughly 6 years and only 5 shots. So it takes a while to reload, and you have to individually load every shell. This means that you can actually interrupt the reload part of the way through in order to fire, which is nice, but it's a little bit finicky sometimes as to when it will interrupt and when it won't. The Psyker also has the classic lightning bolt to explode their head spell psychic power thing that Psykers tend to have, and it does a very good job. It also builds peril as you use it, and if your peril maxes out, you will explode, so you definitely don't want that to happen. You can vent your peril, but it takes a while to go down. You can also just wait for it to go down passively, which takes even longer, or you can use the Psyker's active ability on F. Every class has a special signature ability on the F key, and in the Psyker's case, it's basically a force push on steroids that does a big, huge conal AoE push that knocks almost everything down and staggers elites and things like that, and vents all of your peril all at once. For comparison, the Ogryn has a sort of shoulder check charge thing they can do where they basically become unstoppable, charge in one direction, and just knock everything in the way over. And it can be a very useful thing to help clear out narrow rooms or passageways and knock down elites and get them away from the squishier members of the team and stuff. So yeah, every class definitely has a very specific kit to it, and once I figured it out, I realized that the Psyker is meant to basically be an elite killer. That's your job. Because your ranged weapon, the revolver, is not very good at taking out hordes, because it's slow and it's massive overkill for just a single horde enemy, but it's really good at taking out specific problem enemies, ranged guys from far away or elites from far away, things like that. It makes you a really good elite killer, and your brain burst psych attack also is the same thing. It's massive overkill on just a single horde enemy, and it's just totally useless for that, basically. But against single problem enemies or big elites, it does huge damage and is really, really good at taking them out. In fact, if you have a Psyker on your team that's really with it and knows what they're doing, they can take out elites like the second they spawn, and they never get the chance to actually threaten the party at all, which is your job. That's what you're supposed to do as a Psyker, it seems. So that's why I gelled with it so well. It's really fun to hack through a big horde of enemies with your sword and then switch to a revolver and snipe some problem big enemy in the distance before they ever become a threat. All of the classes in this game are so different that this is definitely going to be one of those games where you make one of each character just to try them out and see which one you jive with the best. There's going to be probably one of them that you really click with more than the others because they're so specialized and specific in their roles. But yeah, the ranged combat does feel very good. Like I said, they've done a good job. Even things like the lasgun actually have a good amount of satisfaction to them, which is rare, because a lot of times 40k games make lasguns like these little pew-pew sticks, and I know that the joke in the 40k world is that they kind of are little pew-pew sticks, but still, these are laser rifles. They are meant to be actual weapons. They do kill things. We're expected to believe that these things can hold off like hordes of Tyrannid and stuff like that. They do actually kill things, and they've done a good job of adding some good solid recoil to the lasguns in this game, and really nice sound assets that actually make them pretty satisfying to fire. I know it doesn't make any real-world sense for a laser rifle to have recoil, but this is 40k, and real-world sense doesn't really matter here. The Psyker's revolver is very satisfying to use. It's a really loud pop of a explosion that it creates when it fires. It feels very strong, and like I said, the feedback is great because the sound effects, the animations, and the overall feeling of the hit impacts is really good on these ranged weapons. So they've definitely done a fantastic job of upgrading the ranged combat since Vermintide to be worthy of a focus that it should have in a 40k game. However, another thing they've also done with it that I really like is they've made it to where you can't constantly use your ranged weapons exclusively, because you don't have that much ammo. Ammo in this game is actually a precious resource, and you have to be careful about how you use it. There are ammo pickups around the map, but of course you have to share them between all players, so if one person is really inefficient and is constantly soaking up all the ammo, then everybody's going to run out, and that's not going to work. No individual class starts with enough ammo going into the mission to exclusively use ranged weapons only and nothing else. It just doesn't happen. For instance, as an example, the Psyker's revolver, counting the 5 shells that are in it when you start with 37 rounds of ammo. And this is a game where the end of mission death tally can reach 400 to 600 plus easily. So 37 is not very many at all. You have to actually place them quite carefully and use them efficiently. So this is a game where ranged combat is definitely a focus, and you will be using it quite often, but it's something that you pull out when the situation needs it, not all the time. Progression-wise, it's pretty similar to Vermintide. You will gain levels as you complete missions, and every 5 levels you will unlock a series of 3 talents. You can choose one of each to equip at any given time. These tend to upgrade various passive aspects of your character, or even alter the active abilities you have to do different things and stuff like that. And you'll also find new weapons to equip, as well as get some money and materials to get new weapons from a market. As far as the melee combat goes, by the way, it feels like Vermintide, which is a good thing. It feels very chunky, very heavy, really nice animations and stuff. Being able to use a power sword is really cool. I like that they actually gave the power sword a different set of animations to the longsword, because since they're both just equal length swords, they could have just reused the same animations, but they didn't. The longsword is more of a hacky, slashy weapon, whereas the power sword is more finesse and precise. They've also given all weapons, ranged and melee, a secondary function they can do. So, for instance, with the power sword, you can ignite it and actually use it as a real, actual fact power sword, which is very, very single target focused, but is huge damage and also increases your peril by 35%, so you gotta be careful about that. Interestingly enough, the secondary feature for the lasgun is actually a flashlight, which seems kind of redundant. Missions-wise, if you've played Vermintide, then you're going to be familiar with the overall mission structure of this game. It's going to have very large maps that have a linear progression of specific objectives that you go through. The areas themselves have a lot of detail put into them. There's a ton of just little minor details and some really nice sort of world building and stuff in the maps themselves. They look very, very good, and there's so much little individual work that's been put into the textures and the props and stuff to make them feel like real lived-in areas that have a lot of visual detail without being so visually over-detailed that you can't tell what's going on. The areas are pretty varied, although I will say that the map variance overall isn't huge. Like, one map has quite a few different types of environments that you go through, but multiple maps don't feel extremely different from each other in that regard, if that makes sense. So you'll be experiencing lots of narrow industrial environments, some wide open foyers and interior places, and some like ship hallways and stuff like that, even some sewers and other underground areas as well. So there's a lot more of a focus on like narrow winding passages and stuff like that than the wide open fields of Vermintide, which lends itself to a lot of like cover-based combat and stuff. Enemies-wise, you of course have the expected hordes, the very large hordes of Nurgleites, so you'll be seeing lots of sort of zombie-like enemies, infected creatures of various persuasions. But there are, of course, also the elite special enemies that you'll be facing, and there is actually a really good variety of these, and it avoids the problem that something like Back 4 Blood had, where they were too similar to each other, and they're all quite different and very easily visibly distinguishable, which I like. So you've got stuff like the Tox Flamer, they'll be shooting out green flames everywhere that you very much do not want to stand in. There are, of course, grenadiers and exploding enemies. There are things like the big charging dude that can throw you all around the place and tackle you and stuff, and has some really good animations attached to it. And there's also stuff like the Plague Ogre, which is like your sort of mid-battle mini-boss fight, sort of like a tank. And you'll of course also have to worry about various loyalist guardsmen enemies that actually use armor and range weapons and stuff like lasguns against you. So that adds a lot of extra flavor to the combat, because sometimes you might be chopping through a horde and then the next moment you're like cover-based shooting with your friends, and it adds some welcome variety to the combat. What about issues? Because this is, of course, a beta, and part of the point of a beta is to figure out what's wrong with the game and what needs fixed. I do have a couple of issues with it. First of all, the bugs. The game is a little bit buggy. I didn't encounter too many, like, massively game-breaking crazy bugs, but there are some issues with reload animations playing for too long, or reload animations playing on your melee weapon, which is kind of funny. But by far the biggest bug that I had was there are these sort of airlock-like areas where everyone has to step into a room, the door to the previous area closes, and the door to the next area opens. It's like a loading zone. Well, we had at one point the door open, but there was still an invisible wall there, so none of us could actually progress through the level. We were stuck in this room, and we thought we were going to have to quit at first, but then one of these special enemies spawned, the guy that can tackle you and throw you around, and so we led him into the room, and he was able to tackle some of us out of the invisible wall. And that way we were actually able to continue the mission and eventually beat it, which is kind of funny, but also really broken, and that definitely needs to be fixed. Who knew the solution was to get thrown so hard that you actually break through the logic of the game? The performance definitely needs to have a look at as well. I know that optimization passes are generally some of the last things that are done once a game's content is all ready and polished, so I don't expect a beta like this to perform flawlessly, but there definitely are some areas and some enemy models and stuff that make the performance drop a bit. Even on my system, which is a 3080, there were still some areas that kind of chugged occasionally, and also the main hub area, the place that you visit in between missions to mess with your character and stuff, that performs kind of badly even when there aren't very many other players on screen, so that definitely needs some optimization to it. And also ray tracing just totally breaks the game, but this one they're aware of. They have acknowledged this as a problem. If you turn on ray tracing at all right now, it like tanks the frame rate to unplayable levels and will crash the game after a few minutes. So at least they're aware of that one. I also think that the overall UI for this game needs a bit of a change. I think that it doesn't give the player enough information. Like the in-game UI, for instance, you can't see how much ammo or how many grenades your teammates have, so it can be hard to decide if it's okay for you to take that ammo or if someone else needs it more unless you're actively communicating constantly, because there's no at-a-glance easy way to see who has what. And I think the overall in-battle UI could be overhauled a bit to show more information. The same goes for the equipment UI, which is really just a list and could be made a lot more user-friendly and could have something like a comparison, because right now you can't directly compare two pieces of equipment to each other. Like, you can't compare something to what you have equipped, really. You just sort of have to switch back and forth and see the differences yourself. And also the overall mission selection screen could be a little bit more user-friendly as well, giving you more information about the individual maps that you're actually going to be going on for each of these missions. It just feels like it's very light on information, you know? It's very, like, style over substance. I think that, in general, the UI for this game is acceptable. It does its job, but it could do its job a lot better if it had more information available to you. I'm also honestly a little bit afraid that the progression is going to be a little grindy. It's hard to say right now, obviously, because I only had, several matches to play. It's not like I've been able to play my chosen character for like 10 or 15 hours or whatever, but still, even through the amount that I played, it gave me the impression that the later levels are going to become quite grindy, and getting to have all of your talents and stuff and some good weapons might take a while for each individual character that you're trying, which is kind of unfortunate. I expect it to take a little while, but I think it might take a little too long in the current state of the progression, and maybe some of that could be slightly accelerated a bit to be a little bit less grindy than Vermintide was. That would be nice. But overall, my thoughts on the Darktide beta is that it's a really fun time. It's got some issues, it's got some things that need worked out, but the overall foundation here, the game itself, is very, very fun and does a very good job of transitioning the Vermintide gameplay into a 40k experience with more of a focus on range combat and stuff, and the individual character classes are very fun to use, as well as very distinct from each other, which I very much like. So this has been my view on the beta. Expect more Darktide content once the game actually releases. Eventually, I'll be able to hopefully give you much more of a detailed breakdown of the game itself and how it performs and how all this stuff has been solved, hopefully by the time of the game's release. Thank you guys very much for watching. There will be a link to the Steam store page in the description below this video that you can check out, and I'll see you guys next time.